Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey-Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, March 7th, and we will hear Beyond the Rainbow, LGBTQ plus preservation. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to answer those. For questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the Q&A box, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. I will ask that if your question is for a particular panelist, that you state that in the question. It just helps me when I'm organizing and getting the Q&A started. Coming up on your screen, and it might look funny, and I'm sorry, I'm on a different device today, are our consortium members for 2025. Thanks to all those participating members for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we're sponsored by the LGBTQ and Planning Division. We're so glad you're here today and that you're bringing us this webinar. Coming up on your screen is a list of our next 3 upcoming sessions. You can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And just as a note, our next webinar, which is on March 14th, normally our webinars are from 1 to 2:30 Eastern time. This one is in the morning to accommodate our friends through the international division. We have some folks that will be queuing in from across the pond, and we just want to give them the opportunity to do so. Today's session is worth 1.5 CM credits and 1 of those equity credits. So to log your credits, head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and a weekly reminder of what's on tap. We record all of our sessions and we post them to our YouTube channel. So head over to YouTube and type in Planning Webcast. We will pop up along with our well over 500 session recordings, all available to you for free. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you get notified when another one of our recordings becomes available. Lastly, this is new for this year. We have an email list. So you can take a picture of that QR code, or head over to our website, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and sign up to receive 1 email a month. I promise it is only 1 email a month from me that reminds you of our upcoming sessions and includes a link for you to register for those sessions. So be sure to subscribe to our mailing list so that you are in the know. That is the end of my housekeeping items. Again, if you have questions for our panelists, just type them in that Q&A box and we'll get to them at the end during our Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Alex, to kick things off.
Yes, thank you, Christine. Hello and welcome all. My name is Alex Westhoff. I'm a senior preservation planner with the San Francisco Planning Department, and everyone can see my slides, correct?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. Joining me today is Tanya Tully, Historic Preservation Supervisor with the City of Raleigh Planning and Development Department, and Max Chavez, Senior Architectural Historian at 106 Group and formerly Director of Research and Special Projects at Preservation Chicago. Firstly, we want to thank everyone for joining us today. We also want to thank Ohio Planning for hosting, as well as the APA LGBTQ Planning Division for serving as guest host. We encourage interested folks in joining the APA LGBTQ Planning Division for more networking and professional development opportunities. I also wanted to mention that this is the webinar version of the in-person session we did at last year's National Planning Conference in Minneapolis. We had great attendance and robust discussion at that event, and in that vein, hope this session is encouraging and inspiring. Of course, this topic is fraught with more challenges today than it was just a year ago. There have been some recent concerning activities surrounding this issue. This includes references to transgender people recently vanishing from the Stonewall National Monument webpage, as well as the LGBTQ America theme study being removed from National Park Service's website. We recognize this unfortunate turn of events, but don't necessarily have great answers. The three of us, though, represent three different local governments in three different parts of the United States, and we hope that this session can empower attendees with tools and approaches to uplift the stories of LGBTQ communities through preservation programs at the local government level. I did, though, want to share the National Park Service theme study. Christine will drop the PDF in the chat for all to download. This 1,200 plus page document contains a wealth of information, which can be applied locally as well. It's definitely worth reviewing, particularly if you are new to this topic. And I'll now pass it along to Tanya, who will kick off the presentations.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, are we seeing? All right, looks like we're seeing
Looks
the right thing
good.
there. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and skip past this screen. Thanks to Alex's introduction, didn't really have anything additional to add. Except that my portion of the talk is going to focus on what a historic context study is and the development of the City of Raleigh's LGBTQI plus historic context, which is an initiative of the Raleigh Historic Development Commission and the city's Historic Preservation Unit within the Department of Planning and Development. So a historic context study provides a high level overview and historic narrative of a specific theme. Examples from sort of more traditional or National Register focused studies include multiple property documentation forms. Those and other municipal studies are frequently architecture-based or architect-based or neighborhood-based. These kinds of thematic studies are becoming more prevalent, and they are able to include more of the social history tied to historic places. So they identify these places. Some of them, such as ours, may recommend buildings that may be eligible for historic designation, and allows us to actually evaluate places that are identified later in time. The benefits are multiple fold. I think one of the big pieces for us is sharing the information with the public and empowering people of the community to share their history and do additional work, using the information that we have provided, and then also guiding future planning processes within the city. So for us, the process of creating a historic context began way back in 2019 after a member of the local Stonewall sports chapter asked about historic designations. As part, they were planning the 7th annual national tournament that was going to be in Raleigh. He mentioned a couple bars and it's like, hey, can these be designated historic? Well, we realized we didn't know anything about Raleigh's, queer history in order to even evaluate a place for designation. So, and this lack of knowledge also meant that these important places weren't being considered during other planning efforts. So, fortunately, we have support from the city administration as well as city council. And we have a little bit of a budget, so we were able to hire a historic preservation consultant in order to move forward on this. And of course, as most of us know, LGBTQI plus stories, as well as other historically excluded communities, their stories are often overlooked. And here in Raleigh, we still don't have any, well, we just finished our study, but there are no local historic places designated for their LGBTQIA+ history. So as we were going through the project, we had a few, initial considerations as we, were working with the consultants on the scope. This is a situation where, the history isn't visible. It's not necessarily written down. The places where the activities occurred aren't necessarily architecturally exciting. And so, how are we going to celebrate and recognize a space that also that no longer exists? Additionally, there's changing terminology, so we had to decide within a report how are we going to refer to people, because language in the 1960s and 70s is very different than what we use today. This particular photograph is from the 1988 Pride March, which was the first statewide march that was held in Raleigh, which is where I am, but it's also the capital city of North Carolina. Throughout the project, engagement is, it's always an important part of any sort of study, but in this case, because there's not a lot of, there are a lot of unwritten stories, it's really important that we, are able to connect with the people from the various communities. We had, some of our standard community meetings, we had in-person and, virtual. We did make intentional phone calls to, organizations such as the local LGBT Center, and the North Carolina State University has a LGBT student group. We did utilize oral history interviews. This is one of the first times we've used them in our reports, so I think we've learned some from that. And then we have online surveys. And by surveys, meaning we had some questions mostly related to, asking people what's important for you, what was a meeting place, what was a bar. They could type in and then, mark it on a map. And it didn't matter if they knew the address or not, they were able to place it. And that kind of information we were gathering over the course of the study. And then, once we had a draft, there was the opportunity for people to review and comment as well. This is an example of a place that is no longer existing. The Cardinal Tap Room was in one of the hotels that's been demolished, and example of what I'm sure many folks have seen. It was, they lost their liquor license because of the apparent immoral conduct as determined at the time by law enforcement. The report contents, has a few pieces. It is the general history of Raleigh's LGBTQI+ communities by decade. As we continually had to remind the the people that were actively involved in the study, this is not a full history of Raleigh's gay people. It is a snapshot of what we know now. It is an overview, and there is more work to be done, and there's no way in this form of study that we could tell the full history, but it is a place for us to start. As part of this information gathering that I mentioned before, the surveys and the meetings, we developed a list of 250+ places that we know about now. Any place that anybody mentioned during any of the opportunities for comment were added to this list. For places we were able to find an address, we did that. If we knew of some historic association, we would add that. But even if all it was, somebody said, back in 1972, I like to go to this place to read a book and it felt safe to me, it was on there. Okay, I'll leave it at that. We'll go a little bit more. In this list, we roughly categorized the places to include such things as, whether it's a religious institution, an allied business, healthcare, a bar or club, just to give folks a broad idea of the list of places that we found. Additionally, a lot of these places, no longer exist, whether it's the building or the business or both. And then another piece of it was the local landmark designation evaluation of 20 sites, some discussion about alternative recognition, and then recommendations for next steps and future research. The photo here, Pullen Memorial Baptist Church, is one of the, more than I realized, local churches that were and are very supportive of and embracing of the LGBTQI plus community. I will add that I keep saying LGBTQI plus history because at the very beginning of the study, in speaking with the folks at the LGBT Center and Out Raleigh Pride, that's what they asked us to use. And so this is what we use, and most of the time it rolls off my tongue. Next, I'm going to highlight a few of the places that we learned about in part of the during the course of the study. One of the, not really a decades, it was longer, but the pre-1970. So Raleigh before the gay liberation movement, roughly 1870 to 1970. There are places such as the Kitty Hawk Tavern, which was a bar inside the Sir Walter Hotel, which actually is still there and is a Raleigh historic landmark. But this additional layer of history wasn't known. And so that was new information. Nash Square is a state-owned and city-managed square park, and it was used a little bit as a cruising site, but also a lot as a protest site as well. And then there are examples such as the Anchorage Bar, which is, I guess that's where the crafty beer and wine is right now, was an early anecdotal place that, for being friendly to, gay people that we don't know a whole lot about, but it still exists in, future research. And then we do now, it is actually now city owned, but we've got the Dorothea Dix Hospital, which is the state's first mental health facility that purportedly and likely, did mental health with folks that were perceived to have a negative impact for identifying as gay. Oh, hit the wrong thing. And then in the 1970s, that was, leaning into liberation. So there were a lot of, a lot of groups began to be formed. The Triangle Gay Club and the Gay Alliance, they formed some of these places, such as the Community United Church of Christ and the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, both in their own ways, were supportive of the community. The Women's Culture Collective Coffee Houses is one of the very few places we found that were specifically related to women in Raleigh. And then I just love the Holiday Inn. It was another cruising site, and it still exists, although it's doesn't have that wonderful sign any longer. In the 1980s is where we had politics and pushback and advocacy and AIDS. There was the formation of the Raleigh HIV/AIDS support group. You still had your nightclubs. The power company, started off as a Winn-Dixie, and then it was the nightclub, and I think it's back to being a grocery store again. Harrelson Hall was a cruising site on the NC State campus. It has been demolished in the last several years. And then Fairmont United Methodist Church is interesting in that it is where a local minister who subsequently got defrocked, not necessarily from this church, because he was performing same-sex unions, and also founded the Raleigh Religious Network for Gay and Lesbian Equality. In the 1990s, the advocacy continued. You know, the Husted House is a group home for folks with HIV/AIDS. You know, we had bookstore. Legends nightclub is probably the one that most folks around town are aware of. And then the Wren House provided temporary shelter and support to teens. So here are just a few photos of some of the 20 sites that were evaluated for Raleigh Historic Landmark designation. We selected these 20 based on the fact that they're still there. You know, they're what they're significant for is within the study time frame, which goes up to the mid-1990s. We sought a diversity of site type, as well as a diversity of, you know, communities of peoples, and also use the consultant and public feedback, and then, you know, whether or not there was available research. Raleigh Historic Landmark designation is something that comes with the regulatory piece of design review. You need to get a certificate of appropriateness. However, we also in North Carolina have local landmarks are eligible for a 50% property tax deferral. So it also comes with a quite hefty incentive as well. And not all of the places that were evaluated were determined to be eligible for local designation. Most of them were. I do just want to point out the bottom left photo, which was how one of the entrances, this little alley between the Sir Walter Hotel and the other building, is how you went through to get to the back to the, you know, unsigned bar. As part of this and this study, the LGBTQI plus study, and another recent one, our Black Heritage and Historic Places study, we started looking at alternative recognition programs. Because many, in both cases, many of the places either demolished or they're too heavily altered to be considered for either the National Register of Historic Places or even local landmark designation. Owner consent, while is not required for local landmark designation, it is politically preferred. In my 18 years, I'm not aware of any situation where City Council has approved a landmark designation over owner objections. And alternative recognition program does give us that additional flexibility for designation. It could be a recognition program. We asked, you know, folks what they were interested in, and the top 3 vote getters were historic markers, digital mapping, and an oral history program, which we're going to be able to move forward on some of those. Some of the project challenges as we move forward are, well, we're the government, you know, not everybody wants to talk to us. There was some elder gatekeeping, both in terms of some people so caring about their story that they didn't want, you know, they didn't have room for us to be able to tell the rest of the stories. We did anyway. It took a lot of back and forth, and then there was just a little bit of challenge gaining entry into some of the communities. You know, specifically, one of our consultants was a non-Raleighite, even though he was a Black gay man. He wasn't a Black gay man from Raleigh, and so finding the right people to talk to and talk to us, I think was one of the challenges in finding what are likely more places out there. Social history isn't bound by city limits. A triangle-based study, would be useful. By triangle, I mean Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill. One of the things that we discovered through the story is most of the, metropolitan area uh, places and gatherings were, for lesbians, they at some point they moved largely to Durham. So that's not part of Raleigh's story specifically. Anyway, it's a challenge there. And, there are a lot of individual stories. There are some places that were safe for one group of people, while not for others. And uh, additionally, there's not a concentrated area other than the warehouse district. There is a concentration of, bars and clubs, but other than that, there really isn't, one place um, uh, where the LGBTQI plus people, went. And um, when it comes to local or a historic designation in the traditional sense, a lot of places um, moved buildings, over the course of their existence. And the question is, when it comes to designation, we have to determine, which is most important. Moving down a non-regulatory piece, we can be a little bit more flexible because they're all important. The context study included some future work recommendations that you can see listed here. I think I'll mention a few in the next slide. And most of these would involve the public-private partnerships. It's not things that necessarily the city of Raleigh would be able to do. And ideally, moving it out there so it's not just, the government telling the stories, but having folks do additional research. We identified where there's gaps in our knowledge. We'd love to have a photograph for every one of the existing 250 plus places. And we've started a list of the people significant to Raleigh's gay history. And we just want to continue on with that. We are almost done. Actually, we are done with the report. It's going to be taken to City Council on April 15th, barring any weird issues. Our communications team is tying the bow on the graphics, and we're thinking about what are we going to do with it once it's complete. Clearly daylight the document, make sure people are aware that it's out there. We'll be reaching out to the owners of properties who were shown to be eligible for the local designation. We at the city are starting to build a digital map of places. We're very fortunate in that a professor from North Carolina State University reached out, and their queer history class is using the recommendations from our study to do the projects for their work. So we've got a few students that are going to do some story maps based on our work, and some additional oral histories are going to take place. And that is one way that our work is being expanded. We have an annual historic bike ride, and this year the commission chose to select sites from within the LGBTQI within the gay study report. And this is a really fun way for us to share the information about the queer community, but also about historic preservation in general in a very fun way. And then we're working towards implementing one of the other place-based recognition programs that does not have the regulatory piece. And that is the end. I look forward to any questions that you may have. I am looking forward to us, moving forward to implement uh, and do more with the research that we did. Thank you.
All right. Okay, just one second. There we go. I hope that looks good to everybody. All right. Hi. Good morning or good afternoon, I guess, depending on what time zone you're in right now. My name is Max Chavez. I'm currently the senior architectural historian at 106 Group. We are a cultural resource management firm based in St. Paul, but I am here in Chicago. But I was formerly the director of research and special projects for Preservation Chicago. We well, the organization is a sort of local historic preservation advocacy group, which sort of brings me to how I ended up working on this site. So the following slides are going to sort of focus a little bit on a case study that ties into the LGBTQ plus landscape within the built environment in Chicago, and then talk about a few of the different issues that are present when it comes to landmarking sort of queer heritage sites in the city of Chicago that I think are probably not uncommon, or probably not common just to us, but a lot of different cities. So thank you very much, Tanya, because I think a lot of the slides and the information that you presented sets up really nicely for what I'm about to discuss. And there's quite a few parallels that I was noticing as you were going through. So first, let's talk about the building that kind of got a lot of attention here in Chicago, starting in the summer of 2023. So this is the warehouse. It's at 206 South Jefferson Street. If you're familiar with Chicago, this is in the West Loop neighborhood, so just a little bit outside of the Loop, downtown Chicago. And it is Chicago's newest and only third LGBTQ plus heritage landmark as of about the summer fall of 2023. I would sort of like just to point out the appearance of the building that will kind of tie in later, but it is, as you can probably guess, it is a former warehouse building with some really lovely glazed brickwork on the front of the building. So just a little bit of background about the building, if you are familiar with it or not, if maybe you're a fan of house music out there. But the warehouse opened in 1977. It operated in the same place in that space from 1977 to 1981. It was a queer nightclub, mostly catering to Black and Latino men, with Frankie Knuckles, who is an openly gay Black man himself, as the resident DJ for the nightclub. So the building was purchased by a man named Robert Williams. He was sort of hoping to bring something different to Chicago. At the time, Chicago nightlife was, not necessarily fulfilling what Robert knew coming from New York City. So he wanted to create something a little bit different, a little bit more engaging, and a lot more sort of sonically and musically interesting. So he purchased this sort of rundown warehouse in a little bit more of a ignored part of Chicago in that era, which is hard to imagine now if you've been to the West Loop and you see a lot of the hotels and restaurants and bars that are there now. At the time, it was sort of an ignored neighborhood in the city. While fitting it out, he chose to install a sound system by Richard Long and Associates. If you're familiar with music history at all, this was a sound system that you could have found in Studio 54 in New York City, Ministry of Sound in London. I mean, it was kind of the best that money could buy. So just that alone, it was really becoming a destination. But Williams came to his friend Frankie Knuckles in New York, and recruited him to come to Chicago and said, please, I need a DJ for this space. I'm really trying to create something different, something special here. So the nightclub opened in 1977. It's important to remember that at the time when this club opened, we were sort of moving into a very quick about phase for popularity of disco in the United States at that time. By 1979, you had Saturday Night Fever, and the tide was starting to turn. It was definitely one part was a sense of oversaturation of the music, but disco music was also becoming very quickly associated with Black and queer people. And as a result, there kind of came this cultural animosity that was attached to disco music because of homophobia, because of transphobia, and because of racism. And this sort of famously culminated in Disco Demolition Night in 1979 at Comiskey Park in Chicago, wherein disco records were brought out, they were blown up. It sort of turned into a miniature riot there at the field. It was mostly an audience of white people, and it was a really ugly moment. So as a result, this kind of animosity in this sort of American culture that turned against disco was pushing a lot of these spaces underground for queer and Black people who wanted to go and listen to disco or things that are similar to it. So that sort of sets the scene for why the warehouse came to be such a important and popular space. So it was there that Frankie Knuckles began to blend, on his turntable, sort of disco, rock, soul, gospel, R&B, electronic music, and he was coming up with something completely different. Soon, this space that was really just for mostly for queer Black men kind of became known as the only place that you could listen to this style of music. You have to remember, what was going on DJ sets and nightclubs wasn't necessarily playing on the radio. So as a result, the warehouse, that association, the style became known as house music. But as you can see, it was a really comfortable open space for a lot of people to come and spend a night here or dance into the morning. It was a safe space that you really couldn't find too much in Chicago. So eventually Chicago became known as the home of house. And as we know, house spread across the world. It's come to define popular music for decades. And it all started in this one particular building. So cut to 2023, we found out when I was at Preservation Chicago that the building had been listed for sale, and a lot of the marketing materials were sort of pitching the idea that, hey, the building doesn't have landmark protection. So as a result, it's pretty open for development. And again, the West Loop is a pretty hot spot for development right now. So we were certainly concerned about the building's future. We weren't necessarily against it being redeveloped or incorporated into a new development, but we wanted to protect the space, the facade, and sort of the fabric of the building itself. So that sort of brings us to an interesting twist about how we kind of engage the community, because this was such an urgent sort of moment where we knew we had to save the building. It had been purchased by a law firm. The law firm wouldn't tell us what their plans were for the building. So we announced the building as one of the 7 most endangered sites in Chicago in March of 2023. Normally, we would have liked to have done sort of a long community engagement process where we work with what we call in Chicago house heads, people who really love house music, the DJs who are performing there, community members who would have been dancing there or going out there at night. But we didn't really have time for that. But we knew that this was probably going to attract not just local and statewide attention, but probably national, maybe even international. So we created a change.org petition sort of in lieu of a sort of long drawn out campaign of organizing and working with the community. And it was the right move. Ultimately, I think within just a few weeks, you can see that we gained up to almost 15,000 signatures. And it was sort of amazing. First it was Chicago, then it was Illinois, then it was the West Coast and the East Coast. And after a week or so, Montenegro, Hong Kong, Bolivia, Australia, every corner of the world was sort of signing in support and leaving comments about how house music changed their life, and how important the building was to save and have it landmarked. Here's just a few screenshots from sort of the press coverage that we got, which really shows just how widespread the attention was that was being paid to this effort. Well, what I think was really interesting, and I'm happy that we did it the way that we did, is that I think it would have been very easy for us to just sort of advertise the effort and ask for support for people and just sort of base it on the music history alone. But we knew that the Black and queer sort of narrative of the story was really important. And as you can see, a lot of the comments really, that narrative really resonated with people. And I think it speaks to just how much people want to hear those stories told. And again, these comments were from all over the world. So, there's a really strong thirst and desire to see these stories represented and sort of showcased within our built environment. So as of, like I said, as of summer 2023, the building was landmarked, and it only became just the third sort of queer heritage landmark in the city of Chicago, which I personally, and I think many others would find shocking, given that Chicago is sort of a crossroads for a lot of people in the Midwest, especially people who leave small towns and are coming to the city for a comfortable place for their identity. These are two other landmarks that are here in the city that have a queer heritage attached. One of them is the Gerber House, which is also a National Historic Landmark, sort of the home of Henry Gerber, who established the first sort of gay rights organization in the United States. I was just revisiting the site last night and saw that the National Historic Landmark nomination for this, you can no longer link to it, or you can no longer access it through the link, which I'm sure is probably a result of some of the newer actions of the new administration. But I think it just speaks to, kind of how easy it is for these histories to sort of disappear. And then the rainbow pylons, if you've ever been to the Boys Town or North Halsted neighborhood in Chicago, you've seen these before. These aren't necessarily a heritage site per se, but they are kind of like a placemaking tool that highlight different figures, important figures in gay history. Not necessarily Chicagoans. A lot of them are just sort of broadly American or even international. But it does just kind of create some visual interest along the street. But they were landmarked. I would say maybe about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. So really only two queer heritage sites in the city of Chicago are actually attached to history that happened here in the city. So there's a few obstacles when it comes to preserving or honoring this history here in Chicago. The first one is the Chicago Historic Resources Survey, or the CHRS. It was a survey done of buildings all around the city from about the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, and it is sort of the guide by which buildings live and die in Chicago. They're given a rating. The rating will kind of gauge their importance, and it'll say whether or not you can demolish it, or if you can demolish the building, but with like a 90-day delay and a review process. The problem that has been often pointed out with the survey is that there is no cultural component to it, right? It's strictly architectural. So if the building's beautiful, it's done by a famous architect. If it's a Frank Lloyd Wright, it's going to probably be on the list. But a lot of these sites, just like sort of as Tanya was mentioning, these sites that maybe aren't architecturally sort of stunning, they're maybe a little bit more, everyday looking. They're not on there. But as we know, a lot of these sort of queer history sites were taking place, like the warehouse, in sort of these unremarkable buildings because they were off the grid, and they were provided some level of secrecy and privacy. So as a result, there's an entire section of history in Chicago that's not represented on this survey list because there's just no cultural component to it. Ditto urban renewal. A lot of queer sites of history in Chicago that were on the south and west sides are gone now because they were decimated by urban renewal projects. And so, again, Tanya brought up that question of how do you kind of honor a site that's no longer there? So that's, another issue that we come across is a lot of sites that we know are significant are just, they're not there to be preserved anymore. A lack of financial incentives for incorporation of historic properties into new developments, facadectomies, things like that. There's just no way for a lot of, for preservation advocates to sort of say, like, we would like you to incorporate this building because we understand that there is a financial hardship that comes to saving this building and incorporating it into a new development. Chicago does not have any LGBTQ plus historic context statements. So, it's hard to assess other buildings for their significance if you don't have a context in which to put them. Architectural integrity criteria for landmarks are pretty strict in Chicago. That ties in again to sort of the CHRS and the issues that you see there. Because we could, thankfully the warehouse was actually a pretty building and it was in pretty good shape in terms of integrity. But I sort of shudder to think, had the building not looked the way that it did, would we have been stuck losing the building because it just wasn't necessarily as architecturally, visually important. And then owner consent, which is another thing that Tanya touched on, is that, it's very difficult to build a landmark building in Chicago if you don't have the owner consent. Politically, I mean, you can do it, but again, politically, you don't really want to do it. And so the warehouse was one of those rare instances where they actually moved ahead without owner consent until the owners, because of the press, did agree to did agree to landmarking it. But it was a very rare instance. And so there's other situations that we've encountered where, you know, it makes it very difficult to move ahead with getting something landmarked if the owner has no interest in doing that. So as a result, there's a lot of historic sites related to LGBTQ plus history in Chicago that have been demolished in recent years. I won't go too far into all of these, but I think one that's interesting is Man's Country, Clark Street, formerly, it used to be in the Andersonville neighborhood. It's a very famous, sort of nationally renowned bathhouse that was founded by a man named Chuck Renslow, a very famous photographer, queer photographer, founder of the sort of international Mr. Leather program. So a very important place, gathering place for gay men in Chicago, recently demolished for a development. I know that there was a residential development. I know there was sort of a question of trying to incorporate, and ultimately that was scrapped again, probably for financial reasons. The Belmont Rocks are no longer there. They've sort of been covered over with a sort of concrete revetment, I guess you could call it. You know, it was a very popular gathering place for queer people in Chicago during the AIDS crisis. Little Jim's was the first gay bar in Boys Town that was recently demolished for a medical center. The Chicago Coliseum, you know, a famous building in its own right, very architecturally important, but the site of a lot of very early drag balls and drag performances in Chicago. But that one was unfortunately a victim of some of the later urban renewal programs of the mid 20th century. But this is not to say that there's not also existing Chicago landmarks that are protected that don't have LGBTQ history. These are all important places. They have, you know, obviously the Jane Addams Hull House is important and very well known. But these all have a queer narrative attached to them. However, the landmark reports that exist for them on file, you know, that's sort of the go-to Bible, the resource of information for these properties. They don't mention anything about the LGBTQ plus heritage that's attached to them. And so it's unfortunate. I mean, these places, you know, a queer person or a queer history heavily informs why these places are important, but that part is sort of that portion is a little bit washed out of the narrative. And the unfortunate part is that, at least, you know, I haven't worked at Preservation Chicago for a year now, but I do not think anything has changed in terms of a mechanism to go back and add sort of an addendum to these reports to sort of flesh out that history a little bit more. So, you know, it is unfortunate that there's not really a way for us to, at least right now, to sort of tell that fuller story about how LGBTQ plus people have informed places that we know are extremely important. And I wish I could go into all these sites right now, but I can't. But if anybody has questions on these places, I'd be more than happy to provide it later on. So this is also to say that there are landmarks in waiting here in Chicago, but without sort of, you know, the CHRS, the Historic Resource Survey that I mentioned earlier, you know, acknowledging cultural histories, or without an LGBTQ plus context statement written by or for the city to place all these into a context, there's no way for us to really move ahead with some of them, especially not without owner consent. But the Jeffrey Pub is a long-standing bar and sort of nightclub on the south side. One of the oldest sort of catering to Black men existing in the city. The Bijou, really important sort of early adult cinema and later sex club, which, you know, presents its own sort of host of issues of people who maybe don't feel comfortable landmarking something because it might have a sexual or sort of salacious historical association with it, which you know, obviously presents its own issues when it comes to advocating for something. People like us, the first gay bookstore in the city of Chicago, and then the sort of the final home of Henry Blake Fuller, who was the first American novelist to explore gay themes in his novel Bertram Cope's Year from 1919. So there's all these really great places that I think would make really wonderful landmarks, and I don't think that there's really anybody who would argue with them, and I think a lot of people would celebrate it. But unfortunately, you know, there's a lack of a lot of different tools and mechanisms that would allow us to kind of move to that next step of getting those buildings landmarked. So there's room for improvement, which I think is really encouraging. And sort of given the current climate, I think it's going to be increasingly important for sort of local governments or municipalities to take on the sort of responsibility of honoring these places. So yeah, that's sort of all. I can pass it over to Alex now, but thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Max, and thank you, Tanya, for your great presentations. And here we go. So everyone can see my presentation. Yeah. Once again, my name is Alex Westhoff. I'm with the San Francisco Planning Department, and I'm here today to talk about historic preservation in San Francisco. I'll specifically focus on the South of Market, Leather, and LGBTQ district, but talk about a few other sites as well. Let's see. So if you leave my presentation with just one take-home message, it's to develop your historic context statement. Historic context statements are critical to inform city landmarks, cultural resource surveys, environmental review, and more. San Francisco's LGBTQ historic context statement was adopted in 2016. So this 400+ page document provides a very comprehensive overview of the city's diverse LGBTQ history. I can say as planning department staff, we are constantly referring to this document to identify and evaluate sites with LGBTQ associations. And Christine will share a link to our context statement in the chat. So keep your eye open for that, and you can review it in full. And certainly progress has been made, but of course we still have a while to go. Of the city's over 320 individual landmarks, only 10 have LGBTQ associations. However, prior to the historic context statement adoption, there were only 3, and so that number has actually more than tripled. Additionally, the queer landmarks have become more geographically diverse and not just located in the Castro neighborhood, but spread through other parts of San Francisco. They're more diverse within the LGBTQ spectrum. For example, as of 2021, we have our first landmark with a strong lesbian association, specifically the Lyon Martin House in Noe Valley. That was the home of long-term pioneering lesbian activists Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin, who founded the Daughters of Bilitis, the nation's first lesbian rights organization. Additionally, the Turk and Taylor intersection represents the first landmark with a particularly strong transgender association as the site of the Compton's Cafeteria riot, which was a response by Tenderloin sex workers and drag queens to police harassment and preceded the better-known Stonewall riot by 3 years. The San Francisco Citywide Cultural Resources Survey is also heavily informed by historic context statements. SF Survey is a multi-year effort to identify and document places and resources of cultural, historical, and architectural importance to San Francisco's diverse communities. These places and resources include tangible aspects of our environment, such as buildings, structures, objects, sites, and districts, as well as intangible aspects such as oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, festivals, and traditional crafts. SF Survey is taking steps to center preservation in racial and social equity, better reflecting the dynamic resources that make San Francisco unique. We are a few years into the project, but still have years ahead of us and tens of thousands of properties documenting as we are surveying every single building in San Francisco. So as I dive into talking about Soma Leather, I just want to give credit where it's due. It's always important to get to know your local historian. This woman, Gail Rubin, has done an enormous amount of work documenting the South of Market, also known as Soma's leather history. Through her continued community involvement, she serves as an incredible resource with a wealth of information. And if you are interested in this topic, I strongly urge you to follow her work, some of which is reflected on this slide. So firstly, what is leather? Gail Rubin defines leather as a distinctive subgroup of male homosexuals organized around sexual activities and erotic semiotics that distinguish it from the larger gay male population. Leather culture began as a statement against effeminate stereotypes often associated with gay men. While its origins can be traced back nationally about 2 decades prior, there wasn't much of a scene in San Francisco until the 1960s. So why South of Market? During the 1960s, the neighborhood was characterized by a mix of large industrial sites, junkyards, and vacant buildings. The post-World War II Soma demographic was largely single male workers of various ethnicities with blue-collar jobs. Based on Soma's low-income population, the neighborhood was targeted by the city's redevelopment agency, viewing it as Skid Row, and whose efforts included eminent domain, demolition of residential hotels, and evictions. During this transitional period, the burgeoning leather community took foothold in the neighborhood, taking advantage of the cheap rents and nocturnal privacy which Soma offered. Though a handful of bars catering to the leather community existed in the city prior, the Toolbox at 399 4th Street opened in 1962 and is credited as Soma's first leather bar. The bar and its enormous mural by gay artist Chuck Arnett was featured in a two-page spread in Life magazine in a groundbreaking 1964 article, Homosexuality in America. It is believed to be the first time a photograph of a gay bar with its patrons visible appeared in the national mass media in the United States. This very much served as a calling card to the outside world, beckoning gays throughout the nation to relocate to San Francisco due to the robust gay scene which was forming. A second bar, Phoebe's, at 1501 Folsom Street, opened in 1966. Phoebe's became famous for featuring the Leather David statue, which was reproduced and distributed internationally. When Phoebe's replaced the Toolbox as the most prominent leather bar, it helped make Folsom Street the anchor of the leather scene. Motorcycle clubs were very much key to early leather culture and used these bars as meeting spaces. Other gay bars concentrated along a 3-block strip of Folsom Street included the Stud and the Ramrod, which opened during the 1960s, thus furthering the neighborhood as a leather enclave. The proliferation of leather bars continued through the late 70s, expanding to surrounding streets. Beyond bars, other leather-associated businesses included publishing organizations, restaurants, nightlife venues, bathhouses, and more. Soma expanded quickly as a sexual center for gay men, acquiring nicknames such as the Miracle Mile and Valley of the Kings. In 1970, there were nearly 20 gay bars and bathhouses in the neighborhood, and by 1980, with the introduction of discos, the total was close to 40. So according to Cale Rubin, other U.S. cities, including New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago, had larger leather scenes, though generally were more dispersed compared to San Francisco's scene. The city's unique concentration of leather institutions and highly visible street presence lended to its notoriety. Additionally, the global attention which the city's leather scene gained popularity can be partially credited to Drummer magazine, which moved from Los Angeles to San Francisco in 1977. Drummer, with an international readership, featured local people, bars, and dungeons. Thus being featured in Drummer magazine, Soma leather was put in the international spotlight. While the 70s were perhaps the heyday of the scene, a variety of factors led to the decline of Soma's leather culture. In the 1970s, the city's redevelopment and demolition activities forced many of the neighborhood's bars and sex clubs to relocate. And of course, the onset of AIDS in the early 1980s was a huge threat. It's easy to assume that this collapse occurred because gay men were dying of AIDS in such large numbers. However, many critics state that bathhouses and sex clubs were closed out of fear and panic surrounding the spread of AIDS, but in fact were not contributing to its spread. AIDS, the closing of the bathhouses, redevelopment, gentrification, and displacement are all factors that have contributed to the decline of Soma's leather, economic, and cultural vitality. And of course, the COVID-19 global pandemic caused further decline. That said, while it isn't what it once was, there is still a very obvious leather presence. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the annual Folsom Street Fair, the most prominent but not the only annual festival, which has long celebrated the neighborhood's rich leather heritage while attracting thousands of visitors from around the world. If you're ever in the neighborhood, check out Ringgold Alley's leather memoir project. Ringgold Alley served as a late night gay cruising spot prior to the onset of AIDS and was the original location of the Up Your Alley Fair, now called Dory Alley, which began in 1985. 28 people are honored with boot prints along Ringgold Alley between 8th and 9th Streets. The Soma Leather and LGBTQ Cultural District is one of San Francisco's 10 cultural districts and one of 3 with an LGBTQ association, along with the Compton's Transgender District and the Castro LGBTQ Cultural District. Established in 2018 by a Board of Supervisors resolution, the Cultural District is a nonprofit organization that is managed by a board of directors. Each cultural district develops the cultural history, housing, and economic sustainability strategies reports, also known as CHESS reports. The CHESS reports serve as strategic plans, identifying partners and funding opportunities to help meet goals of community stabilization and anti-displacement. The Leather District CHESS report was recently adopted by the Board of Supervisors, and a number of place marking efforts have already been seen in the neighborhood to better mark the neighborhood as a leather district, as shown on this slide. And the Planning Department is working to sharpen the racial and social equity lens within our current planning work. Part of that includes better collaboration with the cultural districts, including the appointment of staff liaisons to each of the 10 districts. However, what was previously lacking in the Leather District was a city landmark. So I'll now discuss the Eagle Bar as San Francisco's first and only leather landmark. To my knowledge, it is the only living leather bar in the world with a landmark designation. So why the Eagle? What makes it significant? It is not the first leather bar, as it did not open its doors until 1981. However, with a tenure of over 40 years, it is the longest lasting. Many other leather bars didn't last more than 10 to 12 years on the high end. So here's the Eagle lying at the corner of 12th and Harrison Streets. It's been under 3 different ownerships, all with slightly different interests in the type of events that the venue hosted. And prior to writing the landmark report, there wasn't a great deal of context specific to the Eagle. Thus, oral history interviews were conducted with long-term community members. Through the interviews, a common theme arose when discussing the venue that the Eagle goes well beyond the traditional role as a bar, not just a social space to drink alcoholic beverages. But for 40 years now, the Eagle has served as a de facto community center for Soma's leather and LGBTQ communities. A variety of events have taken place there, from dance parties, live music and comedy, leather contests, extensive fundraising, art exhibits, political organizing, and so much more. In addition to the long-term tenure, one of the things which really struck me about the Eagle's significance is its fundraising efforts, particularly for AIDS-related charities. The Eagle opened its doors just before the onset of AIDS, and through the 80s and 90s lost 22 employees to the epidemic. Under the Reagan administration, federal response to AIDS was non-existent, and the San Francisco model of AIDS care was established, which heavily relied on support and compassion from community groups to care for AIDS victims. The Eagle became a hotspot for fundraising activities, including a number of recurring events, some of which have continued through today. Sunday Beer Bus are perhaps the venue's best known events, dating back to the 80s and attracting both local regulars as well as international tourists. These events can raise thousands of dollars in just a few hours, generally for AIDS-related charities, but other causes as well, which have included suicide prevention, breast cancer, and homelessness. The Bear Chess Calendar is another well-known annual fundraiser since the 1980s. Millions of dollars for AIDS charities have been raised amongst these events and others. So this slide identifies themes from the historic context statement which were applied to this designation report. Having an adopted historic context statement made it easier to articulate the Eagle's significance as it related to broader trends and events surrounding the community. And of course, CEQA is an incredibly valuable preservation tool. In case folks from outside of California are wondering what CEQA stands for, it stands for the California Environmental Quality Act, which requires historic review as part of any development review. Under CEQA, an eligible SOMA LGBTQ district was established in 2017. This discontiguous historic district identifies dozens of leather-associated sites. I'm highlighting a particular site on this slide, 365 to 367 12th Street, which is right across the street from the Eagle. When deciding if something is a resource, as Max suggested, there's often an overemphasis on architectural merit, but it's important to look beyond that and beyond just the year built and beyond the early context of the neighborhood, but look at later periods of significance as well as events and people, not just architecture. So this 1907 property lies directly across the street from the Eagle, and through historic review, we uncovered that this house was the site of an S&M church in the early 1980s, and thus we added it to the CEQA eligible district. Thankfully, the developers revised their plans to better respect the existing character, but we're still able to add 2 new dwelling units to the site without having substantial impacts on the front facade. They also agreed to further commemorate a plaque about the S&M church and the broader neighborhood leather context on the front facade, with the content and design being developed by the cultural district. So CEQA is a 2-step process that applies to all discretionary actions. If a project comes in which proposes to demolish or alter the facade of any age-eligible property, meaning 50 years or older, we first must determine if the property is a historical resource. If it is a historical resource, we must then determine if the project will have an impact on that resource. So I'll jump out of the South of Market and discuss another LGBTQ site. This is the Nob Hill Theater, which was a long-running gay adult theater dating back to the 1960s. It was sold by the business owners a few years ago, and developers purchased the property. But through applying the historic context statement, planning staff determined that the site is individually eligible under CEQA for its association with the gay male community from 1968 to 2018. Developers had proposed to convert the space into a medical office with 4 housing units above. This sparked some interesting discussion about how to preserve certain elements of the site, such as the permastone facade and the iconic front facade blade sign, though we couldn't require them to retain the touch our junk lettering, unfortunately. But given the project is going to have a significant impact on the site, including alterations to the facade and the interior auditorium, we did require a robust mitigation package, which included architectural salvage, interior and exterior displays on the site's history, oral histories, a nighttime facade display, retention of the vintage blade sign, detailed drawings and photography, as well as a coffee table book. So here's the context statement once again, but it's fairly prescriptive in regards to integrity evaluations. In the case of San Francisco's LGBTQ history, most properties are significant for social cultural histories under National Register criteria 1, events, or number 2, people, and not so much under 3, which is architecture. As the historic context statement states, in these cases, the most important aspects of integrity are location, feeling, and association. Design is also important, though it goes on to say that more flexibility should be offered for this aspect. It then states that setting, materials, and workmanship are less important. I think this is an important point to make. Max mentioned challenges with sites that have lost some integrity, but we have good language in this historic context statement, and this is taken from national bulletin registers so that there is sort of a defensible approach to evaluating integrity for cultural significant sites. It then opens up the question on how to evaluate these sites, and it's important to remember that integrity is subjective. One test that context statement discusses is to assess if someone who were familiar with the property during its period of significance would recognize it if they were to visit it today. To gauge integrity of association and feeling, it further states that enough intact physical fabric would need to remain so that it would be recognized by someone from that time period that would come back today and look at the building. And so one recent example that had applied this more flexible approach is the site of the Compton's Cafeteria riot. I mentioned that earlier. That was designated recently as City Landmark 307 and the location of transgender community riots against police harassment in 1966. The landmark itself is largely an urban intersection at Turk and Taylor Streets in the Tenderloin, but includes a portion of the historic Compton's Cafeteria storefront. I'll wrap up with that, but you can check the landmark designation fact sheet. The storefront that had contained Compton's cafeteria has undergone 2 significant changes since 1966 and is no longer an active storefront. The design and materials have changed, yet is still completely recognizable as the location, setting, feeling, and associations are extant. Anyways, that is all I have, and I think we'll turn it over to questions and answers. Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay, let's dig in. The first question, I'm going to start with you, Tanya, and then if others want to chime in, please do. So the question is, what year are we typically looking at to consider a building or site as historical? And then the follow-up question is, so for example, a bar or tavern from the 90s or 2000s, where's the cutoff point?
Sure.
And I hope it's before that.
Sure. So for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, you've got the 50-year timeline, generally speaking. But for local landmarks in the state of North Carolina, there is no date. There is no how old it ought to be. It's really left up to the local's jurisdiction. So I think the earliest one we have had designated was Dorton Marina, and it had only been around for 30 years at that point. So we'll see. That's the youngest one so far. I think it would matter like how important it is.
Max or Alex, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would personally echo that it is, yeah, with the National Register, that is sort of like the cut and dry rule, but locally it is a little bit more, you can kind of make it up as you go a little bit. I know in Chicago, I mean, the Rainbow Walk, the pylons that I was talking about, which is sort of the place speaking thing, it was really only about 10 years old by the time that it was landmarked. And you know, I'm not quite sure what the sort of reasoning was behind landmarking and protecting it, but you know, they felt that it was significant enough to do it. But I think after that, the warehouse is probably the second most recent. The period of significance for that is 1977 to 1981. But outside of that, yeah, it's usually sort of that 45, 50 year cutoff. But if there's a outstanding cultural history that can kind of be tied in, I think they can make an exception. But
And Alex, do you have anything to add?
No, I think my co-panelists covered it, but it's there's discretion at the local level in terms of age eligibility, so we're not tied to the National Register requirements.
So regardless if it's a local designation or something on the registry, is there any concern that being on these lists could make the place a target? And if so, what can we as the planning community do to help prevent that? And do you have any examples?
well, you know, that's a good question. I mean, I can't speak to any sort of like a queer heritage site, but I will say that in my previous experience, we did have a property in Chicago that we were sort of interested in landmarking, and the family was not interested. They were for a second, but then they ultimately decided not to because it was the site of their family member who was a political figure in Chicago, and he had been assassinated at the home. And so there was concern that sort of, you know, putting a stamp on the property and saying that this is, you know, there's an association here, could be, you know, sort of dangerous. So I think it's important that if there is that concern that, you know, maybe the community voice wins out. And if they don't want to move ahead with that, I think it's really important to honor that. But it's tricky, and I'm sure as the political landscape shifts, it's going to become a more pressing question. So I don't know if I have an answer for that officially.
I would agree. It's not something we've encountered yet, but definitely a conversation that we will need to be having.
In terms, so when I think of historic places, I think of some type of physical structure. What about locations where demonstrations happened or something super significant on a particular site that doesn't necessarily have a physical structure tied to it? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I can I can speak to, we have at least, one example that came up in our study, which is Nash Square. There is no physical structure on it. It's got some walkways. And that was the site of multiple, cruising sites and protests, and not just protests related to gay history, but also civil rights and all of that. So there's the layers. We can address landscapes. It doesn't have to be just a building on it. I think where a bigger challenge would be like marches that run along a public right of way. I don't think that we would be able to do any sort of official designation, but this sort of alternative celebration would be the way we would go for that.
Thank you. Next question. Are there any online archives that any of you would recommend that our attendees check out? If particularly we want to work on preserving queer histories in our communities?
That's a great question. I'll say that I find that if you really want like hyper-specific things about your local area, most major metropolitan areas will have some sort of resource, even if it's not an archive, maybe like a mapping sort of resource where things are documented. If you're in Chicago, for example, there's the Gerber Hart Archives, and that's a really extensive collection of materials. So if you're in Chicago or the Midwest, they have a lot of things that kind of cover the general region. But yeah, I don't know, maybe my colleagues can speak to something more specific to their areas as well.
Well, our consultant who finished up the report has a very extensive bibliography. So, watch our project page for when that goes live. In our area, certainly, local universities is where we found some collections, both from, periodicals that were, student periodicals that were in place, and then also like the papers of some people as well. So that's where I'd start. And then if you're in the South, there is Invisible Histories, which is a project archiving generally LGBT histories in the South, which they finally got as north as North Carolina. So
we have like the GLBT Historical Society, so I would suggest people look into their historical societies if they do have any surrounding LGBTQ history, but they have great digital photographs collections, which is super helpful for understanding a building and any alterations that have happened if they have documented those. Also, the Bay Area Reporter is a sort of the gay periodical going back to the 70s, and those have all been thankfully digitized, so it's easy to do keyword searches of specific places or people and obtain a lot of information about them. So those are some great resources.
Thank you. And someone typed into the One Archives at USC is one of the largest LGBT archives in North America. Okay, so next question. Let's say that you are a planner on the call who doesn't live in a large metropolitan area where there might be information readily available on the cultural history. The question that came through is asking, what can we do to celebrate or to record the cultural history of the LGBTQ community in smaller areas that don't maybe even have a rich history or that have live in a fairly conservative space that might not have kept such records?
My suggestion would be to start talking to people and taking oral histories. And that's that's all I've got.
I would suggest looking at the National Park Service theme study. I'm not super familiar with the document, but I think the objective is that it could sort of cover themes, events, trends that are important on a nationwide scale, and hopefully can be applied to smaller communities and not just large cities.
I'd also probably suggest, I mean, obviously Chicago is not a small town by any means, but there's a lot of sort of online sites that people have created, either blogs or mapping projects, where people have started to compile this information, and they're really valuable resources. And I think that if you can just find a website to just like host this information on, hopefully it can live on for a while as a document. So, if you can get that information, Tanya kind of beat me to it, I think, with the oral histories. That's a really important part of it. There's so much out there that's just not captured, it's just in people's minds. So if you can get that down somewhere, really, really valuable stuff.
Do we know, is there a way to access previously public government web pages that have been recently taken down? And are there organizations that are archiving and providing public access to them?
So in the South, that Invisible Histories project, they have been doing sessions where people sign up and they're doing, archiving of websites. There's the Wayback Machine, which is, I was just searching when, I can't remember, one of you mentioned the National Historic Landmark had been removed, and I looked up our local one and it's gone too, but their site is still on the Wayback Machine. Yeah. So web.archive.org, and then whatever you're looking for.
I was going to suggest the Wayback Machine as well as the Internet Archive. So Christine, maybe you can share that link in the chat.
Will do. And I'm going to share a couple other links too that folks are typing in, just for reference. Do you have strategies right now to continue ensuring that work moves on in this area, given the current political environment?
I don't know that I have a strategy right now. We're very fortunate that we have an administration, and local administration and city council that has not made any changes and is moving forward. We just hired a new director of our equity and inclusion department. So mine is just hope. Not very helpful to anyone else.
I mean, I wish I could offer better suggestions, but we're in a fairly blue bubble in San Francisco. So no one's really questioning what we're doing. Both our Historic Preservation Commission and Planning Commission did pass racial and social equity resolutions in 2020, and that's tied into our citywide cultural resources survey that I mentioned. And so we're still continuing pretty strong with that, and that's all getting local funding. And so it's everything that's going on federally isn't really holding us up right now.
I also think,
go ahead.
I mean, yeah, I think, depending on, again, where you're at regionally, it could behoove some groups or even you as the public person to maybe push, at a city level, given the current climate, to maybe for your local municipality to start taking on projects like this. I mean, I could imagine somebody going to maybe the city of Chicago and saying, okay, given everything that's going on right now, is there going to be interest in trying to preserve these sites here in Chicago, since we know that these things are going to be threatened, possibly nationally. So, it's definitely not a solution per se, but maybe just an idea of using this kind of current moment to put pressure and try to ask for these things at a local level.
Last question, and we'll start with you, Alex. The question is, was there any hesitancy by the owner of the Eagle Bar in deciding to make it a historic landmark? And what would the trade-offs be for a queer bar to get that status? And then I'll just take it a step further and say, and I don't really know the historical landmarks, how many just nationally might be bars or clubs or anything of that nature, but taking the question a step further, of designating those types of establishments in a national register, is it difficult to do?
Sure. So as far as hesitancy goes, I think Tanya mentioned this in her presentation, but similarly in San Francisco, we don't require owner consent for landmarking. So as far as property owner consent, the business owners were definitely interested in landmarking the Eagle, and they were the ones that reached out to their local supervisor, and there was threat that the building could be purchased, and new property owners would want to do something else with that. So the city did sort of move forward. There was a lot of political will and community interest in landmarking the site. So the business owners were definitely on board, and we notified the property owners of it. And that's what we do for, it's sort of a, just letting them know this is happening, a courtesy notice, I guess, and inviting them to attend the Historic Preservation Commission hearing. But we did not hear from them since the notification. So we did what we were required to do. So I'm not sure if there was any pushback that has since happened. And there are some, and you mentioned trade-offs, but there are some incentives to landmarking sites. There's the California Historic Building Code that historic buildings can be exempt from certain modern code requirements. There's also some code incentives, like certain, they can be exempt from other local planning code requirements. And so there are some benefits to becoming a historical landmark.
Others, anything else?
Sort of on that topic of how, the question of how hard it is to make something, maybe
Mhm.
get something on the National Register or even as a landmark.
Sure.
When it comes to the National Register, at least, I think it's very much dependent on just what state you're in. A lot of these determinations are made by the local state historic preservation office, or SHPO. I'm working on projects in Minnesota. The Minnesota SHPO is, I think, pretty amenable to those kinds of projects. But I'm sure that there are other at state levels that might not be, make it a little bit more difficult. I think when it comes to like local landmarking, I mean, obviously it's going to depend on where you're at and politically, but I think there's also this question that we run into a lot of. It's hard to advocate or get a building landmarked until it's endangered. Everything's sort of
Interesting.
reactive as opposed to proactive. And so, the warehouse, when we finally did a lot of community engagement and working with the, people who had been wanting to see the warehouse landmark for a while, they told us, well, we had submitted this as a request for a landmark years ago, and it never went anywhere because it was never endangered. So it wasn't until we had sort of like here's a thread and here's a call to action. And unfortunately, that kind of gets you into a position where it's,
Yeah.
you're sort of on the razor's edge of waiting for that building to possibly be demolished or not. So unfortunately, that you kind of need that narrative sometimes, but that puts you in a really precarious situation.
Sure. That's a good point. Thank you.
Mhm.
I have 2:30 on my on my clock. This just flew by, as they always do. This was a great conversation. I know I learned a whole lot, and I have some Googling to do after this. And I appreciate all of your perspectives and all the work that you do, and for coming here and doing this today. We appreciate you and the division, the LGBTQ plus and planning division. And I put their link to their division webpage also in the chat, along with a whole lot of other links. So feel free to grab those. Again, we are recording this session. We'll post it on our YouTube channel. It'll probably go up on Monday sometime. Don't forget to log those CM credits. This is good for an equity credit, so get that if you need it. And don't forget to register for our upcoming sessions. All the information you need is on our website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. So thanks again to you, Alex and Tanya and Max, and for everyone attending today. And everyone have a great weekend. We'll talk next time. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
you.
Thanks so much.